And welcome back. Before we go ahead and start applying our own background and stuff to this image, I want to take a moment to take a step back and look at some existing backgrounds to kind of bring out the discussion about three different kind of things that go into an image. So I'm going to go ahead and look at this GIF that we looked at earlier. And in here, one of the things that we notice with here is, like I said, we have kind of some distinct layers in here. So we have our foreground here, which of course is this zone, which has the turtle. We have this kind of little bit of trees over here. We have the grass. Then there's also what is known as the midground. So the midground is kind of this zone here with the cliff side. And this is, of course, drawing our eyes to more of the scene. You can also notice that in terms of some of the saturation values, our foreground is much heavier and darker in some of our saturation in comparison to our midground. And then lastly, on the other side of this area, we have our background area here, which is, of course, the backdrop that we have here, which, of course, gives us, in this case, just some more trees and a hillside, but, of course, it is still part of that. Now, I just want to see that in comparison with some other images. So I went and found some other Pixar images to look at. And here, of course, we have some other pieces. So here we have a cityscape. And so we, of course, again, are using contrast to help show different things, using different saturation values. So, for example, the front of our image is right here. And this, of course, is drawing our eyes to this foreground here. So notice there's no characters here. It's all just skyline. But we can still use things like saturation to really help draw things out. And of course, in between that zone, we have kind of our midground, which is, of course, these other buildings here. And of course, you can see as we move a little further back, we are decreasing that saturation. And we are getting lighter and lighter in some of our hues and tones. And lastly, of course, we have our background, which is just this skyline with this sun that is setting here behind the cityscape. And if we look at one more, here's a little bit more of a scenic take. And here, of course, we have our foreground here, where we have our landscape here with a little bit of road. We have this little bit of a water effect here. We, of course, then have our midground, which is actually our mountains and a little bit of this hillside here. And then we have our background, which is the sky. And again, now you will notice that as we approach light sources, for example, where the sun is over here, we have a very light amount of our tones. Our hues and saturations are very, very desaturated. And as we move further away from that light source, you'll see that we get darker and darker. So as we move closer to where the camera is here, if you were to think about this as taking a picture, as we move out this way, further and further out, we will notice that the closer we get to that sun, the more our colors are desaturated. And that's why you can see here we have very light tones over here. But even in the sky, even in my background, as I move further out in my background here, you can see out here I have very large, very heavy saturated tones. Whereas over here, my tones are much more muted, much more diminished in terms of some of that saturation. And of course, that's just a couple things for you to think about as we are looking at the different pieces here within this image. And we're going to take these same techniques that are done here within these images and we use those into creating our own. And these techniques are not something that's simply just applied to for these images. If you were to go and look at things in real life, you will see the way the atmosphere kind of blends things with the different things moving through the air. We will see that our foreground and stuff typically is much more saturated. It's still got these darker tones. Our midground is, of course, going to have a little bit more desaturation before we move into our background up here. And that is going to give us just a little food for thought here as we move into things. And I want you to try and challenge yourself. Think about how you could make a picture with even just, I'll getting into too much detail. You can try, but even if I were just to go and try to make a color just with a background, which is, let's say, 3 colors here. I have my background, my foreground, and midground. If I have color 1, 2, and 3, how would that look there if I were just to go ahead and create an image with just 3 different tones? Whether I'm manipulating the hue or the saturation values here, how would that look? And keep that in mind as we get ready into our next lesson when we start applying those techniques here into making our first background.